G'day fellow Av Geeks, welcome back to another episode of our Victor One podcast. Joined with me yet again, Jack. How are we?
Good to be back. Keen for this episode as always.
Today we'll be discussing about life as an air traffic controller, and joined with us today is our special guest David Binskin. He is a general manager at Sydney Metro Airport. We'll first ask about your position and how you got to that position, David.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Normally I sit at the careers night and sit on a panel of people. It's a little bit different doing it this way, but thanks for having me here. My position is General Manager Aviation for Sydney Metro Airports. We're lucky enough to run both Bankstown and Camden airports together. And to get to this role, I've been in the aviation industry for a bit over 30 years. And prior to being General Manager Aviation, I was with Air Services Australia as an air traffic controller and air traffic control line management, operating mainly in the Sydney Basin. And I was the manager of, at one point, of all the control towers in New South Wales, which was good fun. And I used to be part of Brisbane Centre, where I was a radar sector driver.
Yeah, no, awesome. In terms of what are the main differences between working as your role, particularly working as some of those Class Delta aerodromes as opposed to working as an en route controller for Brisbane Centre? What are some of the main differences or challenges that you've experienced in?
Yeah, so being a sector driver was good fun. The only difference was you didn't have a window. You were sitting in front of a radar screen for the full shift. Mm-hmm. The airspace I was controlling, I was part of TOPS Group in Brisbane. And we had the airspace across the northern parts of Australia, top end of Western Australia, Northern Territory and North Queensland. And we also operated the airspace around Darwin with the Air Force. The Air Force would do Darwin approach. And we would do everything outside outside the approach area. The biggest difference is being a tower controller is lots and lots of fun. You get to look out the window. It's more feeling part of the aviation industry. Sitting at a radar screen, you're talking to blips on the screen, and but in the tower you're actually seeing the aircraft and seeing what they're doing. So I really enjoyed being a tower controller.
Yeah, no, it sounds like I suppose with a tower controller, you're really at the heart of that airport, and it's up to you, I suppose, to ensure the expeditious flow of traffic in and out of those airports. And imagine, especially working at some of those Class Delta aerodromes, you're dealing with all sorts of levels of experience. So I suppose you always have to be on your toes for that as well. But yeah, in terms of, I suppose a good question would be from there, out of all the Class Deltas you've worked at, what would you say is the most difficult to work at? And what would you say the most rewarding thing is being a tower controller at one of those airports?
I'll start with the most rewarding thing. The most rewarding thing is always finishing the day on where you've had a really good day. You've interacted well with the aviation community, and everything has worked. Tower controllers occasionally have a bit of a tanty over the radio when things don't go as what they plan, but it's always good to have a good shift when everybody's playing the game. One of the most rewarding things I've ever done was I've 3 consecutive air shows down at Avalon. I was lucky enough to be a tower controller down there and to be able to work in with all the international pilots and general aviation pilots as they were coming and going. I was lucky enough to be involved in the International Air Show for a couple of years in a row.
I suppose that as with the air shows as well, not only do you get to communicate with all the different types of guys, but you also ensure that you're also in a very integral part to ensuring the air show continues and progresses well. And I suppose one of the things I suppose that people, it's one of the things that is critical to ensuring the air show runs at all, really. So it's definitely, I suppose, at the end of the day, you'd get that kick of saying, well, not only have people experienced seeing all these aeroplanes, but I played a key role in ensuring that everything runs smoothly and it could run at all, essentially. So no, I totally agree. That would definitely be a good kick out of that for sure. Calvin, do you have any other things to add about that, or any other questions you'd like to?
I was just curious. ATC experience a lot of abnormal scenarios and stuff. I just wanted to ask David, what would be your most memorable, say, emergency or something just funny on the radios?
Yeah, look, it's you have your ups and downs. You have there's some emergencies that have happened. I've unfortunately been involved in some of the ones that have involved in the loss of life. Really, air traffic control and aviation is it's very repetition. Lots of repetition involved in it. Your normal day, it's probably about 90% the same. But the advantage is that what's not normal actually sticks out, and it sticks out very quickly and very early. And for people that, there's probably a lot of pilots listening to this podcast, you can actually feel the issue coming and sense it coming before it actually turns up. It's you're prepared. You look at air crash investigation. That's great that they can make a series out of something that really only takes about 20 to 30 seconds to happen. And they can stretch it out for an hour. You can feel it coming. Some of the good things that have happened. My family, I got a brother who was an F-18 driver for the Defence Force, and I was lucky enough to be working Brisbane Centre one day when he came out of Darwin in a 4-ship of 4 Hornets. And it's one of those ones. Why did I go into air traffic control? Because Mum said, "Why don't you be like your brother and be a fighter pilot?" So I'd become an air traffic controller so I could tell him what to do.
Oh, and that one, that's a really good one.
Yeah, so I was sitting in Brisbane Centre one day, and my brother is the lead Hornet, and 4 Hornets coming out of Darwin, and comes on frequency and requests a clearance for Delamere weapons range, and I just hit the press to talk, and it all went quiet, and all I said was, "I've waited years to tell you what to do." And my loving brother come back and said, "Shut up and give me a clearance or I'm going to tell Mum." So so you do have fun times, and there are some times when there's been some emergencies out there, but hey, at the end of the day, it's a very rewarding job.
Yeah, no, totally. I suppose the responsibility of having to ensure that everything runs smoothly and everything, and you're essentially controlling and ensuring the safety of all those people out there is a very rewarding thing. And something that I suppose keeps you going every single day. And just, I suppose, a nice segue from that is, I'm sure there are those guys out there who want to, or are prospective air traffic controllers, or those who may have considered at one point, who may continue into that avenue in the future. Can you just, provide an insight into the pathways, especially given, I'm sure you've overseen many guys coming through, and or not only your own experience going through, what else, I suppose, is the main pathway or the process of getting into that role, and what you can expect in those initial few years of doing that job, I suppose.
Yeah. So the pathway is an interesting one. It's got a lot to do with life experience, and it's not that the more you see, the better you are. I applied to transfer from a flight data officer, which was an assistant air traffic controller, into air traffic control when I was about 19, and I failed the entrance exam. But I tried again a couple of years later after I had a little bit more life experience under my belt, and I was able to draw on a few more experiences in my answers and my knowledge of aviation. And I was lucky enough to breeze through the aptitude testing. So it's got a lot to do with where you are in life, and what you've been through, and the things that you've collected along the way. Normally for air traffic control in Australia, they'll advertise normally via things like seek.com, or maybe in the newspaper or aviation magazine. And you have to do some aptitude testing to be able to unlock the application form. Then you fill it out, go through the process. If you're lucky enough to be deemed successful and suitable for the role, then you will go off to Melbourne and do some training down in Melbourne. And this is the civil side of things, of course. There's always the Air Force side, but the civil side, you'll go to Melbourne and do some training down there, and then you'll be posted out. It's a very, very rewarding job, and a fun job too. Very, very much a team environment. You have the practical jokes in the background and all that type of stuff. But when it comes to actually controlling the aircraft, everybody's very professional. And they fully know exactly what job needs to be done.
Yeah, no, exactly. And in terms of, and would you mind, I suppose, elaborating on what people could do to prepare for that? Or in terms of life experience, what life experience would you say is most critical things that you would recommend doing to, I don't know, so help you in that application process and to, I don't know, I suppose form a very good skill set to becoming an air traffic controller?
Yeah, so the good stuff about trying to get that life experience is always put your hand up and do that, just that little bit more. The more you do, the more experience you get. The fields to play in are very much around the aviation industry. If you're learning things like phonetic alphabet, the way the call sign systems work, the way the aviation lingo, if you want to call it that. There's a certain way we all talk. We talk a lot in acronyms. So if you can get your head around, that type of the way things work, it makes it a lot easier. You can pick up on that. You don't actually have to go and get a job in the aviation industry. It's a lot easier if you do. But, you can listen to, there's a few apps out there like Flight Radar 24. You can look at Live ATC. You can listen to, where you can listen to the air traffic controllers in Sydney, Bankstown and Camden, or any other big aerodromes around Australia. And you can pick up on the way and the thinking process. And there's also a few games out there at the moment, a few flight sim games that you can also jump on and have a play of.
Yep. Yeah, no, given something that one of the things I do is there's this online flight sim platform called VATSIM, and I suppose that'd be very good. That'd be a very good platform as well, where you're an air traffic controller and you can handle those virtual guys online as well. That's obviously a very good platform to go on as well. But and in terms of I would say, because obviously there are air traffic controllers as a whole is broken down into various subsections. You've got your terminal controllers, your ground, surface clearance delivery, tower approach, departures, and then you've obviously got your en route controllers as well. As a natural progression, I would say from I suppose doing your training and whatnot, is that initially as a Brisbane or Melbourne Centre controller prior to then moving to those Class Charlie and Delta aerodromes?
It really all depends on your skill set and where you may be headed towards and what applications are open at the time as well. But you could be trying to go through, you might want to be a tower controller, but they might only be accepting en route courses at the time. And you might want to be an en route controller, but there's just tower controls. Or your skill set when you turn up may be more beneficial towards becoming a tower controller than an en route controller. It really all depends on what your interests are, and there's no real progression in either stream as such. But it's more about there's other factors than that really talk about your career. You might even you might want to be a controller and go to Tamworth or to Coffs Harbour or something like that, because that's the area that you're from. And you put your hat in the ring and you try and get back there if you can.
Yeah, no. So I suppose it's just a matter of just trying each one and seeing which one you like most and trying to pursue it. And in terms of, well, now I suppose as a segue to your position as a general manager of Sydney Metropolitan Airports of Sydney, of Bankstown and Camden, in terms of the impact of obviously COVID now, of course, like most of the flight schools are still operating at either at both airports, apart from UNSW, obviously. Would you say there's been much of an impact in terms of, because most of the traffic operating through those airports is the flight training schools, or either you still have that charter, medevac, and also air freight. Would you say there's been much of a decline in traffic through there? Obviously, there might be some, but in terms of, is it as profound as obviously some of the other airports out there?
It's I'd say it's not as profound as Sydney, because Sydney has unfortunately lost a lot of their international and domestic passenger areas. We are still operating. We are well below where we would normally be. When you look at the statistics over March, April, May, you can see the dip when the government put certain restrictions in place, and it's a lot of the private pilots, because the Prime Minister said, if you can stay at home, please stay at home. And a majority of, being pilots, we follow the rules, and the rules were that was exactly what we did. So you've got essential services still going. So you've got out at Bankstown, we've got toll ambulance, we've got the police based out here as well. RFDS use us. There's a few fly-in, fly-out organisations that are still here, and we've got the bank runners are still going, because they're all essential. They all need to be happening. With the flying schools, we've seen a dip in what's going on there, because the flying schools have adapted well to the scenario, to the situation around them. You've got flying schools that pilots are now wearing face masks. They're cleaning the aircraft through the day. They're doing a lot of single pilot training. When they're doing classroom, they're ensuring that they've got social distancing and they've got the right amount of people in the room inside the regulations, things like that. So they have adapted well. There are some flying schools that aren't operating. You mentioned the University of New South Wales. They're not operating with us at the moment. But we're waiting for them to come back with bated breath. We're here and ready to play.
Yeah, no, and I think we're definitely keen to get back. It's just more the university is very risk averse at the moment, which I suppose is fair enough. But in terms of
exactly right.
And we are trying to get back as soon as possible. And in terms of, is one of your roles as the general manager to ensure that everyone remains compliant with all the regulations as well? You talked about knowing flight schools are doing that. Is that based off word of mouth of what they're saying they're doing, or is it also part of your responsibility to enforce that as well?
So when it comes to those rules and regulations, they're government enforced. We put as much information out to the flying schools. We might point them in the right direction of what's happening out there. Most of them are doing it off their own back and taking care of things as they to ensure that they are operating inside the guidelines as laid out by the government. Do I monitor it? No, I don't, because it's the responsibility of the flying schools. Yep. But my observations are that they are observing the social restriction rules, and they are putting mechanisms and risk mitigators in place to ensure that they're operating inside that rule set.
Yeah, no, which is I don't understand now that I suppose it's more their responsibility. I think all of those flight schools are not also they're compliant, like you said. They have to be compliant in many other ways as well beyond this. So I'm sure they're more than happy to comply with those at the moment. And I suppose just going beyond or excluding the realm, or actually no, we can include it now. Is in terms of is COVID, has it affected the development in terms of Western Sydney Airport? Is that still going full steam ahead, or is that halted for the meantime?
Unfortunately, I've got nothing to do with Western Sydney Airport, so I can only go on what's in the media. And as far as I'm aware, that they're still continuing. And I believe the date that they were working towards was December 2026 for the first aircraft to arrive out there. And my understanding is that they're still working towards that at the moment.
Okay, yeah. So obviously for Western Sydney, when I think about it now, Western Sydney's airports beyond this is your exclusively Bankstown and Camden. And going into that, in terms of, I suppose, I remember speaking to you about this last year, the Careers Evening, the impact of Western Sydney Airport on Camden and Bankstown, more so Camden, considering it's right next to that Bringelly region there, the control zone's right there. How's the development of all this controlled airspace, namely the Class Charlie airspace and the steps above that? How is that going to affect that previously, I don't know, free Class Golf airspace, and how's that going to affect the traffic inbound and outbound to Bankstown and Camden? So
that's still going through the government processes at the moment. We've been lucky enough to put a submission in to the department, because they asked for submissions from all aspects of the aviation area who thought that they may be impacted by Western Sydney going ahead. That hasn't been, the final outcome of that hasn't been published yet, and I'm not privy to their final stance either. But look, there's some common sense stuff here that yes, the flying training area will change. When you put the control area steps in, there will be some changes to flight paths in the Sydney Basin, but we've been lucky enough to be able to come up with some ideas and put forward to the department about how we as an industry feel that we could assist in ensuring that there's enough training area out there by moving and almost giving back the same amount of volume of training area that's going to be displaced, and moving some of that to the north, up north near north of Richmond, and down south of the Holsworthy Weapons Range, and pretty much between the coastline and Wilton. As I said, we've been lucky enough to be able to put a submission forward. And yes, there are going to be some changes, but it doesn't mean that flying is going to stop. And that's the big thing and the big message that we're trying to get out to everybody. Bankstown's going to still operate. Camden's going to still operate. There will be some changes in the basin to the flight paths, but we're still going to be here. We're investing quite heavily in Bankstown and Camden to ensure and for people to know that we're still going to be here. We put Toll Ambulance went in the last few years. Their building and their base here. We've got the Police Aviation Command building currently being built. So we're going to have ambulance, police, and RFDS use us on a regular basis. So yeah, we're still going to be here and we're still here to play.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the most important thing as well, because I know a lot of people. I know a lot of people out there were like, I suppose rightfully there've been some skepticism in terms of how that will affect the Sydney Basin or the airports there as well. But I think like you said, you're doing everything you possibly can to ensure that there are still viable areas to go train and for banks to continue operating. And like you said, people are still there's still infrastructure going on or plans to build infrastructure there as well. So that's I suppose really good for both Bankstown and Camden, and they are essential as well, because obviously you still need a training airport or those class deltas within the Sydney Basin to continue to operate as well. So no, that's really good news. So I suppose for prospective, I suppose flight schools or people that want to go into instructing or work out of Bankstown, is that they're still going to be operating full steam ahead. So that's the main thing, I suppose. And
that's exactly right, Jack. And just it's one of those ones where we're keen to put our money where our mouth is. So we're currently, as I said, we're building the Pol Air development, but we're also going through a process. So people out at Bankstown will see a bit of work out here starting from around the 1st of June. We're actually replacing and upgrading all the lights on Runway Centre and the Northern Taxiway. So there'll be a little bit of work out to airside, putting in new pit and duct system. There'll all be LED lighting that'll be going in out there. So we're investing in the place because we know we're going to be here. We must operate the aerodrome as for aviation. It's federally legislated that we must do that. And there's on the lease, I think it's a 50-50 lease, and I think there's about 70-something years still on that Commonwealth lease. So we're going to be here, and that's why we're investing in the place.
Yeah, no, and that's really good that you're doing that. And I'm sure that will also incentivize also that you're upgrading all that infrastructure and facilities as well. They'll also incentivize people to continue to operate there as well, which is good. And that's also good. Like you said, it's a foundation of the Sydney Basin. It needs to be there. And like irrespective of a new airport or not, there will still be ways, more than perfectly viable ways to operate there as well. So that's really important. And that's really good that you're implementing that lighting there as well for Runway Centre and whatnot as well. I know initially. I know a few years ago, runway 29 left, 11 right used to have runway lighting as well. Was there? 29 right and 11 left. Was there?
Yep, that's it.
Sorry, yeah, I've got them switched around there. Is there any plans to get that back? So I know obviously at the moment at night time you're restricted to runway centre operations only. Were there plans to bring that back, or is just not enough demand at the moment to make that a viable option?
It actually doesn't come down to demand at all. So at the night time, we can only operate on a single runway anyway, whether it's the northern runway or the centre runway. It doesn't matter which one's got the lights. We can only have one operating at any one time. So the lights on the northern runway were decommissioned. We struggled to get some parts for that type of light. So what we did was we decommissioned, but in decommissioning it, I know that the aviation community liked the fact that we had a backup runway that had lights on it. But we invested heavily in portable lighting. So I've actually got enough portable lighting out in the compound to light up runway centre if the lights on it actually fail. We've actually got a backup there, and these lights are sitting on their battery chargers. And so if we've got to grab them and run, yeah, we've got enough lights out, runway lights out there to light up runway center without a problem.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Yeah, I suppose because like you said, I didn't realize that you couldn't run simultaneous operations at night. No, but yeah, no, I suppose I can understand why people were a bit apprehensive about that. But as long as you can put the portable lighting out there, because I know I've asked you a question about how long does it actually take to install those? Because I know the AIP, you're meant to have aircraft are meant to have holding fuel, especially IFR aircraft are meant to have some holding fuel for when the lighting's not there and when they have to install the portable lighting. How long does that process actually take?
So it all depends on how quickly I can load up the ute and get them all out there. So probably give us probably about 15 minutes. But we've got a representative here from 5 a.m. until 9 p.m. 7 days a week. If it's outside those hours, you would give me about half an hour because I've got some staff members that live only about 15 minutes away from the airport, so they can be here and load up the portable lighting and get them out there. So, you know, on a normal evening when I've got a representative here, probably give them about 15 minutes and they'll have those lights out there.
Yeah, right. And they're just would they just be runway edge lighting as well? Is that just runway edge lighting?
I've got enough lights out there for runway edge lighting, threshold lighting, red and green lights. So yeah, I've got enough to light it up.
Oh yeah, awesome. That's really interesting. I didn't actually know what the process was like. But that's pretty cool. And I suppose one of the fun things I'll ask you is in terms of that. There's been a lot of discussion about the new Pole Air hangar right next to the threshold of 11 left there. Mm-hmm. And in terms of particularly if you have a nice northerly wind or in the summer, you get some nice mechanical turbulence coming over the roof of that. What are some of the plans that you had to, or some of the considerations you had to go through with Pole Air prior to building that and placing it right, like I suppose right next to the threshold there, in terms of how it would affect particularly light aircraft on short final for that runway, and some of the considerations or NOTAMs now that you have to apply for that new hangar?
Yeah, so any development near the runways must go through an aviation assessment. It's quite interesting. It's called the NASF guidelines, the National Airport Safety Guidelines. And it's one of the ones we need to go through are wind shear and turbulence investigations. Now, it's not a cheap exercise, and it takes a lot of time. And what they will do is they will use 12 months worth of data taken from the Bureau of Met, and they'll work out what the prevailing wind is, and they'll work out how, in the periods of a northerly, what strength it needs to be to create turbulence off any building, and how that would affect aircraft. So in regards to the Pole Air building, an investigation into wind shear and turbulence was conducted with that building. And with the winds and the percentage of the winds that come through that direction, and it was deemed that any wind shear or turbulence that could be developed from off that building would not reach the threshold and cause safety issues for aviation. It's funny you should mention how close it is to the threshold. The toll priority building at the 29 end is actually closer to the threshold than what the Pole Air development is. I don't have a record of any concerns coming with the toll priority building whatsoever.
No.
But we're quite heavily going through, as I said, any development that is around the runways and or pretty much inside the envelope around the runways. We make sure that we go right through a wind shear and turbulence investigation and to see if there are any concerns. And if there is a concern, I've got to mitigate against the risk. Advantage of having 3 runways, which means that if mechanical turbulence does disperse over a distance. Yep. So you can have, if you've got turbulence on the northern runway, the pilot can request a southern runway, and that would give them another 220 metres away from that turbulence, and the turbulence diminishes over that distance.
Yeah, no, and I suppose it's also it's also probably sufficient as well as if it's like a really windy day, especially if you've got a strong northerly as well, and particularly during the summer months where during the afternoon, you're most likely landing on runway 11. I suppose you can also put on the ATIS as well, the amount of times they say mechanical turbulence to be expected on the short final. So that should give everyone sufficient notice as well. So no,
yeah, exactly right. Exactly right.
So no, it's good to, and I'm sure you went, and it's good to hear. It's just interesting to hear about all the processes you have to go through. We're just building that building because obviously we're just sitting there one day seeing this big pole hanger going up, and you're like, oh, I wonder what the process was to get that established and built. But that was really good, David. Good.
Yeah, the Polo building was actually a 2-year process, and it had to go through a major development plan because of the size and the value of it, and the location of it, and its effect on aviation, to make sure that everything was mitigated against, any risk was mitigated against.
Exactly, and as you said, aviation is probably the most risk-averse industry out there. So no, I'm sure you went through all the required processes, and it sounds like it's all very it all worked very nicely. And like you said, people have the options there, so there's definitely ways to get around that fact. Anyway, but we're now nearing the end. I'd just like to ask Calvin, do you have any final words or any questions you'd like to ask David before we finish for today?
No, not really. Everything's really technical for this podcast. Out of my vocabulary skills, if you will. But no, not really. I guess you explained enough for people to reconsider if they want to become like air traffic controller, because a lot of people are quite confused. Everyone says ATC go under a lot of stress and it's a lot of training, but I guess you gave us a better insight of what they will be expecting if they do decide to chase that occupation. We'd just like to give you a big thank you, David, for joining our podcast. Very appreciative on your insight of ATC and what the future of our training airports will be like.
Oh, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on, and I have to be honest, I was a bit devastated that we didn't do the careers night or the careers afternoon again this year. I've turned up as a bit of a regular. I've done it for the last 3 years, and this was going to be number 4, and unfortunately we haven't been able to put it on, but this is a pretty good substitute. So thank you very much for inviting me along.
No, thank you, David. I really appreciate your time today, and I'm sure everyone will learn or take a lot from what you said today. So no, thank you for your time again, and hopefully we can have you back next year for the careers evening.
But I'll be there. Absolutely, I will be there.
Awesome.
Also, a big thank you on Jack for this podcast. He was absolutely on fire today with all these questions. But thanks guys for listening for this week's podcast. Be sure to check us out on Facebook, YouTube, and our LinkedIn. And we'll see you next week.